Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into, well, a pretty important book, I think, in economics called A Theory of the Consumption Function by Milton
Yeah.
Friedman. And this book, it's Prioris.
Yeah.
It's from 1957. And it's had a really big impact on how people think about
Yeah.
the economy and how they think about how people spend money. So I'm really excited to dig into this one.
Yeah, this one's a classic for sure. And it's interesting because it kind of sets out to answer this question.
Yeah.
Of why do people save a consistent portion of their income, even as society gets richer over time? And that's kind of the central puzzle that Friedman's trying to solve in this book.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think it is something that a lot of people probably thought about, like as you get wealthier, you would think that maybe you would spend more of your income, but it seems like that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, it's not quite as straightforward as you might think. So one of the main ideas in the book is this concept of permanent income. And basically this is the idea that people base their spending decisions not just on their current income, but also on their expectations of what their income will be in the future, their long-term earning potential.
Okay, so it's not just about
Yeah,
how much money I have in my bank account right now, but it's also about how much I think I'll be making in 5 years or 10 years.
exactly. Yeah. It's this idea of a long-term average of your income.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So how does he kind of distinguish between that long-term income and then maybe those short-term fluctuations?
Yeah, so he talks about transitory income as well, which is basically those unpredictable changes in your income that don't really reflect your true earning capacity. So if you get a one-time bonus at work, that would be considered transitory income, whereas a permanent salary increase, that would be more a change in your permanent income.
Okay, that makes sense. So winning the lottery would be transitory income.
Exactly, yeah. Or inheriting a bunch of money, things like that.
Got it.
Okay.
So I guess the idea is that people are more likely to save that transitory income?
Yeah, that's the idea.
Hmm.
Because they don't see it as a permanent change in their financial situation.
That makes sense. And so one of the things that I found really interesting about this book is how Friedman uses a lot of data to support his arguments. He doesn't just make these theoretical claims. He actually looks at real world data on people's spending habits.
Yeah, absolutely. He was a big believer in using empirical evidence to back up his theories. So he looks at things like household budget studies and national income statistics to see how people's consumption patterns actually change over time.
And what does he find when he looks at that data?
Well, he finds that the average propensity to consume, which is basically the proportion of income that people spend, tends to remain pretty stable over time, even as incomes rise.
So even as people get wealthier, they don't necessarily spend a larger percentage of their income.
Exactly, and that's kind of the puzzle that he's trying to solve. Because it goes against what some earlier theories of consumption would predict.
Right, because you would think that if you have more money, you would spend more of it.
Yeah, that's the intuition. But the data doesn't really support that.
So Friedman's theory is that this is because people are basing their spending decisions on their permanent income rather than just their current income.
Exactly.
And that's why we see that stability in the average propensity to consume.
Yeah, because even if people's current income fluctuates, their permanent income is more likely to stay the same, so their spending patterns don't change as much.
That's really interesting. So let's kind of dive into the book itself now. In the first chapter, Friedman lays out this puzzle that we've been talking about, this observation that people tend to save a consistent portion of their income, even as they get wealthier. And he says that this is a bit of a mystery because it doesn't really fit with the prevailing economic theories at the time.
Right, yeah.
The kind of dominant theory at the time was this thing called the absolute income hypothesis. And that basically said that people's spending is determined solely by their current income.
So if you make more money, you spend more money.
Exactly.
But as we've been discussing, the data doesn't really support that.
Right. So Friedman is kind of challenging that assumption.
And he's proposing this new theory based on the idea of permanent income.
Exactly.
So how does he go about kind of developing this theory? Where does he start?
Well, he starts by really defining what he means by permanent income. And he says that it's basically the amount that a consumer unit could consume while maintaining its wealth intact.
Okay, so it's not just about how much money you have right now, but it's also about your assets and your debts and kind of your overall financial picture.
Right. It's kind of like
Yeah.
what you could sustainably spend over the long term.
Without having to like dip into your savings or anything like that.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. And he also emphasizes that permanent income is not just about like objective measures of wealth, but it's also about people's perceptions and expectations.
Okay, so it's subjective.
Yeah, it's very much subjective. It's about how people view their own financial situation and their prospects for the future.
So two people could have the same income and the same amount of wealth, but they could have different perceptions of their permanent income.
Exactly, yeah. Because it's based on their own beliefs and expectations.
And that would then affect their spending habits.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. So Friedman is really bringing in this element of psychology into economics.
Yeah, absolutely. He's recognizing that. People's spending decisions are not just based on like rational calculations, but they're also influenced by their emotions and their beliefs about the future.
That's really insightful. So how does he actually go about measuring permanent income if it's so subjective?
Well, that's one of the challenges of this theory. Because it's hard to directly measure people's expectations. But Friedman uses a variety of methods to try to get at this concept. So he looks at things like people's past income, their education level, their occupation, and even their family history to try to get a sense of what their long-term earning potential might be.
So it's like he's building a profile of each person
Kind of.
to try to understand
Yeah.
what their permanent income might be.
Exactly.
And then he uses that information
Ah.
to explain their spending habits.
Nice. That's really clever.
And he also looks at aggregate data,
Yeah.
like national income statistics,
Yeah.
to see how permanent income might be changing over time for the whole society.
So he's looking at both the individual level and the societal level.
Yeah, he's trying to get a comprehensive picture.
That's impressive. So what are some of the key findings that he comes up with based on all of this research?
Well, one of the main findings is that the average propensity to consume is relatively stable over time, as we've been talking about.
Right. And he argues that this supports his theory of permanent income because it suggests that people are not just reacting to short-term fluctuations in their income, but they're basing their spending decisions on a more long-term view of their financial situation.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What are some other interesting findings?
Well, he also finds that certain factors can influence the average propensity to consume, for example. He finds that people who are younger tend to have a higher average propensity to consume than people who are older.
Okay, so younger people spend a larger percentage of their income.
On average, yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, he suggests that it could be because younger people have a longer time horizon, so they're less worried about saving for retirement, and they're more likely to be investing in things like education and starting a family.
That makes sense. They're kind of in that building phase of their life.
Exactly.
What about other factors?
He also finds that people who have more children tend to have a higher average propensity to consume.
Okay, that makes sense too.
Yeah. More mouths to feed, more expenses. And he also finds that people who live in urban areas tend to have a higher average propensity to consume than people who live in rural areas.
I wonder why that is.
Well, he suggests that it could be because urban areas have more opportunities for spending, like restaurants and entertainment and things like that.
There's just more stuff to buy in cities.
Exactly.
So those are just some of the
Yeah.
kind of the nuances and the details that Friedman explores in this book.
Yeah, he really digs into the data to
Yeah.
try to understand all the different factors that can affect people's spending habits.
And it's all based on this core idea of permanent income.
Exactly. It's the foundation of his theory.
And it's a really powerful idea. That has had a big impact on economics.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most influential ideas in the field of consumption theory.
So I think it's definitely worth taking a deep dive into this book and really understanding these concepts,
I agree.
because they can help us to better understand not just the economy as a whole, but also our own personal financial decisions.
Yeah,
So I'm excited to keep digging into this and see what other insights we can uncover.
me too.
All right, well, let's take a quick break, and we'll be back in a moment. To continue our deep dive into Milton Friedman's A Theory of the Consumption Function.
You know, it's fascinating because when you think about those everyday spending decisions we make, it's like Friedman's theory is playing out in real time, right? Like we're constantly weighing those long-term goals against those immediate desires.
It's true, and I think one of the things that makes Friedman's work so compelling
Yeah.
is that he doesn't just present these abstract theories. He really digs into the data to see if his ideas hold up in the real world. Like, he doesn't just say, oh, I think people base their spending on permanent income. He actually goes out and looks at household budgets, national income statistics, all sorts of data to see if the numbers back up his claims.
Yeah, he was a real empiricist, and that's what gives his argument so much weight. He's not just speculating, he's showing you the evidence.
Right. And he's not afraid to challenge those conventional wisdoms, like that idea that as people get richer, they'll just spend more and more. Friedman's like, hold on, let's actually look at the data.
Yeah, and what he found was that assumption wasn't really holding true. People weren't just spending recklessly as their incomes rose. There was something else at play, some other factor influencing their spending decisions.
And that factor was permanent income.
Exactly.
That idea that people are thinking about their long-term financial well-being.
Right. They're not just focused on that immediate gratification. They're thinking about their future, their family's future, and that's reflected in their spending habits.
It's like they're playing the long game.
Exactly.
And one of the things that Friedman does really well in this book is he breaks down this concept of permanent income into these different components.
Yeah, he talks about those different sources of income and how they can affect people's spending decisions.
Right, like that difference between permanent income and transitory income.
Right. Exactly, and he gives some really interesting examples. Like, he talks about how if you give someone a one-time bonus, they're less likely to spend it all at once than if you give them a permanent raise.
That makes sense, because that bonus is just a temporary blip.
Right. It's not going to change their long-term financial outlook.
Whereas a raise is more like a structural shift.
Exactly. It changes their perception of their permanent income.
And that's why they're more likely to adjust their spending accordingly.
Right.
Now, another thing that Friedman explores in this book is the role of expectations.
Yeah, that's a crucial part of his theory, because he argues that people's spending decisions are not just based on their current income or their past income, but also on their expectations of what their income will be in the future.
So it's not just about the hard numbers. It's about how people feel about their financial prospects.
Exactly. It's very much a psychological phenomenon.
And that makes it really hard to measure, right?
It does, but Friedman comes up with some clever ways to try to get at those expectations. Like, he looks at surveys of consumer confidence, and he analyzes how people's spending patterns change in response to different economic events.
So it's like he's trying to read between the lines.
In a way, yeah, he's trying to understand what's driving those underlying trends.
And he's not just looking at the individual level. He's also looking at those broader macroeconomic trends.
Right. He's trying to see how those individual decisions aggregate up to affect the economy as a whole.
And what does he find?
Well, one of the interesting things he observes is that during economic booms, when incomes are rising and people are feeling optimistic, the average propensity to consume tends to increase.
So people are more likely to spend when the economy is doing well.
Exactly. But what's interesting is that this increase in spending often outpaces the increase in income.
So people are spending more than you would expect.
Based on their current income alone. And Friedman argues that this is because they're feeling more confident about the future, so they're willing to spend a larger portion of their income.
It's like they're anticipating that those good times will continue.
Exactly. And that can actually help to fuel the economic boom. Because when people spend more money, it creates more demand for goods and services, which leads to more production and ultimately more economic growth.
This is like a virtuous cycle.
In a way, yeah.
But of course, the opposite can also happen, right?
Unfortunately, yes, during economic downturns. When incomes are falling and people are feeling uncertain, the average propensity to consume tends to decrease.
So people become more conscious with their spending.
Right, they start saving more and spending less, which can actually exacerbate the economic downturn because it leads to less demand, less production, and ultimately more job losses.
Like a vicious cycle.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important for policymakers to try to stabilize the economy during those difficult times.
And how can they do that?
Well, there are a lot of different tools that they can use. But one of the key things is to try to maintain confidence.
So that people don't panic and start hoarding their money.
Exactly, because when people lose confidence, it can really spiral out of control.
And it can be really hard to get back on track.
Right.
So Friedman's theory of permanent income has really important implications, not just for understanding individual spending decisions, but also for understanding the economy as a whole.
Absolutely. It's a really powerful framework for thinking about how consumption works and how it interacts with other economic factors.
And it's still relevant today.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Even though it was published back in 1957, the ideas in this book are still being debated and discussed by economists today.
And they can help us to understand some of the challenges
Hmm.
that we're facing in the economy right now.
Absolutely, like the issue of income inequality
Hmm.
and the role of government spending. These are all topics that are directly related to Friedman's work.
So it's a really timely and important book
Mm.
to be discussing.
I agree. Yeah, it really is a framework that stood the test of time.
Now, as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here, I want to touch on one more idea that I think is particularly relevant today, and that's this concept of average propensity to consume, or APC for short.
Oh yeah, that's a key one for sure.
Basically, it's the proportion of our income that we spend on goods and services. So if I'm earning $60,000 a year and I spend $45,000 of that, my APC would be 75%.
Exactly. It's a simple calculation, but it tells us a lot about how we're managing our finances.
And what's fascinating is that Friedman found that this APC tends to remain relatively stable, even as our incomes fluctuate.
Yeah, that's a key insight from his research. It suggests that we're not just mindlessly adjusting our spending to match every uptick or downtick in our income.
Right. It's like we have this internal compass that guides our spending decisions based on a more holistic view of our financial situation.
Exactly. We're thinking about the long term, we're factoring in our expectations about the future, and we're trying to maintain a certain level of stability in our spending patterns.
It's like we're all intuitively trying to smooth out those bumps in the road.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And this is where that distinction between permanent income and transitory income becomes so crucial. Because it helps to explain why we don't just go on a spending spree every time we get a bonus, or drastically cut back every time we face a temporary setback.
Right, we recognize those fluctuations for what they are, fleeting blips on the radar of our long-term financial journey.
Exactly, and we adjust our spending accordingly. But we don't let those short-term changes derail our long-term goals.
Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this average propensity to consume isn't the same for everyone.
Right, there are all sorts of factors that can influence it.
Absolutely, things like age, occupation, family size, even where you live, can all play a role.
It's like our personal circumstances and our individual experiences shape our relationship with money and influence how we spend and save.
Yeah, it's a complex interplay of factors.
But Friedman's theory gives us a framework for understanding those dynamics.
It helps us to see the bigger picture and to make more informed decisions about our own financial lives.
And ultimately, I think that's what makes this book so valuable. It empowers us to take control of our finances.
Yeah.
And to make choices that align with our long-term goals and aspirations.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we're not just passive consumers. We have agency, and we can shape our own financial destinies.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Milton Friedman's Theory of the Consumption Function. It's a book that's full of insights. And I think it's more relevant today than ever before as we navigate these uncertain economic times. So we encourage you to check it out and to keep those conversations going about how we can create a more stable and prosperous future for everyone. Until next time, happy reading and happy listening.